The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 26, verses 1 to 16. And it came to pass, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said unto his disciples, Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified. Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But they said, Not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat. But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, To what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. When Jesus understood it, he said unto them, Why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work unto me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests, and said unto them, What will ye give me, and I will deliver him unto you? And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Chapter 26 of Matthew is a very long chapter, and it follows the same set of events as chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, which also for Mark was an especially long chapter. And in Mark, this set of events follows on from when Jesus replied to his disciples on the Mount of Olives on the Tuesday evening of Holy Week to say, watch for the second coming. Now, in Matthew, that was at the very end of chapter 24, and then in Matthew we have this chapter 25 that we've covered over the last 3 readings, with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, the parable of the wicked servant and the talent that was buried in the ground, and finally the prophecy of the nature of the parousia, the end of days. And those 3 sections do not appear in the Gospel of Mark. But now the 2 Gospels sort of re-merge, as I say, with this 26th chapter of Matthew coinciding with chapter 14 of Mark, and they do follow very closely. So there will be approximately 6 readings that cover chapter 26 of Matthew, and in each case I will put a link to the corresponding passage of Mark in the description below the video. Now, the first 2 verses of chapter 26 of Matthew do sort of wrap up the very, very long set of teaching of Jesus to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. So chapters 24 and 25, on that evening of the Tuesday of Holy Week, overlooking the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus finishes that prophecy about the end of days. And then in chapter 26 verse 1 we have, And it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he sort of wraps up this lengthy teaching by saying to his disciples, Now know that after 2 more days is the feast of the Passover, the great Jewish festival, the partial lamb that will be eaten as the feast of the Passover. And the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified, and his reiteration of his fate that has occurred over the past months, all the way back to just outside Caesarea Philippi, and then on the road back into Capernaum, and then on the road from Capernaum to Jerusalem, where he was preparing his disciples for this very different end of his ministry than that they envisaged, getting more and more precise, and now he's being extremely precise and saying, after 2 more days, the Son of Man will be both betrayed and will be crucified. And of course those words are absolutely borne out. And then in the following few verses we have a sort of fly on the wall view of what's happening in the Sanhedrin, in the governing body of the Jewish elite, the chief priests and scribes and elders. They're not in the normal meeting place of the Sanhedrin, and this may just be a subset of those who are determined to get rid of Jesus, because we do know that there were some senior Pharisees who were actually very swayed by the words of Jesus, and as we'll see with the action after the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea being one such example, and also Nicodemus. But probably then a subset of the most determined of the Sanhedrin and the chief priests, who, after their repeated humiliation in the in the temple, in their disputations with Jesus, have decided that they want to take him and kill him. And this is in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and we will see him again later on in this chapter. And they don't want to take Jesus captive in public, because many of the pilgrims in Jerusalem, along with many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, along with the multitude that arrived with Jesus, believe him to be a great prophet or even the Messiah. And if they were to try and take Jesus in public, it might cause a riot, and there might be many deaths, including deaths of those very chief priests and elders and such. And these acts of madness and killing were not unknown in Jerusalem, in fact, particularly at the time of the Passover. So they want to take him by subtlety and after the feast day. But as we see, the death of Jesus will be very public, because events will overtake them. And as to that event that overtakes them, it is the fact that one of Jesus' very own disciples is about to turn against him. So now I think we're moving on to the Wednesday of Holy Week, and we are witness to Jesus being in the house of Simon the leper in Bethany, which is a mile or 2 outside of Jerusalem. Now we're in the house of Simon the leper, and nothing really is known about this person. As we know from the Gospel of John, Jesus was very close to a family in Bethany, namely Martha, her sister Mary, and their brother Lazarus. Very, very famous story of raising Lazarus from the dead indeed. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus does stay with that family just before his entry into Jerusalem. So some people think that maybe the house of Simon the leper is connected to that family, whether Simon is possibly the husband of Martha, or possibly the father of those 3 siblings. As to him being called the leper, it might be that his father was a leper, or it might be that he was cured of leprosy by Jesus. Again, we just don't know. And in that house, Jesus and his disciples are having a meal, and a woman comes into the house with an alabaster box of very precious ointment. And from the Gospel of Mark, we know this ointment to be spikenard, which was an exotic herb much known for its fragrance. And she opens this box, cracks open this box, and pours the ointment on the head of Jesus as he's sitting at the meal. Again, from the Gospel of John, there's very strong evidence that this woman is indeed actually Mary of Bethany. She probably was a woman of some means to have access to an entire box of this very precious ointment, because from the Gospel of Mark we learn that it was worth up to 300 denarius, which would have been hundreds of days of the common labourer's wages. So, a very significant sum. And to some degree, understandably at first, the disciples are indignant, and we can understand that reaction if they haven't divined the nature of why she's doing this, and they are grumbling, saying, to what purpose is this waste? Now in the Gospel of John we learn that it's really Judas Iscariot who's particularly indignant about this. They say the ointment might have been sold for much money, 300 denarii, and that money could be given to the poor. Now, as Jesus explains to them, the woman's actually performing a very courageous and sacred duty to him, and so their grumbling is in principle disrespectful to their master, but he overlooks that, but he does defend the woman. And he says to the disciples, why are you troubled, or why are you troubling the woman? She's actually doing a good work unto me. As for the poor, they will be with you every day, and you will have countless opportunities to do them good. But, as I've already said, I will not be with you much longer. And the fact that she's pouring this ointment on my body, she's preparing my body for burial. And in the commentary that I gave on this passage in Mark back in late February, I placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that this woman was staring Jesus' imminent death in the face and acknowledging it and dealing with it. Presuming it was Mary of Bethany, we know from the Gospel of John that Jesus was very, very close to Martha, Mary, and Lazarus as a family. They had tremendous love and reverence for him, and her soul would be torn apart by his imminent death that she absolutely believes is going to occur, because she has absolute belief in what he says. And so this is really a divine and courageous act in that she is not ignoring what's coming, whereas the disciples clearly have been in denial all along about this, and maybe they think that Jesus just is wrong or misguided about this. Maybe they still in their hearts harbour a dream of an earthly kingdom in the mould of King David, when Israel was absolutely the toast of the world, the strongest kingdom in that whole known world in 1000 BC. And they still feel that somehow that's accessible, and that Jesus is simply, misunderstanding his own future. We would call that in modern psychological language denial, and she is not in denial. She's facing what she sees as the reality face on, and she is being courageous. It's not easy to look death in the eye, particularly someone that you love with all your heart. And then we have these very prophetic words here in verse 13. Jesus says to his disciples, "Truly I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world," and this is the gospel of the New Testament, of loving God and loving your neighbour as yourself, that Jesus is entrusting to these very disciples, and prophesying and seeing into the future that it will be preached over the whole world. There shall be this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her. And here we are speaking about it 2,000 years later. What an extraordinary prophecy. And if indeed it were the case, as the Gospel of John indicates, that it was Judas Iscariot who was particularly grumbling about the waste of the ointment, and John in his gospel actually indicates it's because Judas kept the purse for the disciples and may have had some pecuniary interests in that ointment. This rebuke, perhaps focused on Judas, was the tipping point for him and causes him shortly thereafter to go unto the chief priests. And he bargains with them, covenants with them for a price on the head of Jesus. What will you give me that I can deliver him unto you? I am in his band of 12 disciples. I know his every plan, his every move. I'm with him at all times. I can betray him unto you in secret, where you will not have to worry about the multitude. And the chief priests show their disdain for Judas and for Christ by covenanting for 30 pieces of silver, which very tellingly was the price for a slave in Jerusalem. And we learn in verse 16 then that from that Wednesday, at some point on the Wednesday, until the final betrayal occurred a day and a half later, Judas was seeking an opportunity to betray Jesus. And of course Jesus would be very, very well aware of that.